started with a phone call. "Officer Harris? We need you at 1438 Elmwood Avenue. Immediate response required." The dispatcher's voice was tight, controlled, but there was an edge to it. Something I'd never heard before. I'd been with the force for 8 years. Seen some shit. Domestic disputes gone wrong, drug busts, a couple of shootouts. But nothing in her tone prepared me for what I was about to walk into. The house was old. 2 stories, Victorian style, paint peeling, shutters barely hanging on. It looked abandoned, except for the single flickering light in the upstairs window. My partner, Rodriguez, pulled up beside me, his face grim in the dim glow of the street lamp. "You hear what they said over the radio?" he asked, keeping his voice low. I nodded. Caller didn't say a word, just heavy breathing before the line cut out. Rodriguez exhaled through his nose. "Goddamn prank calls, man." But we both knew this was no prank. I pushed open the rusted gate, the hinges screeching like nails on a chalkboard. The front door was unlocked. That was the first red flag. The house smelled like rotting wood and something else. Something sickly sweet. Blood. Rodriguez went left. I took the stairs. They creaked under my boots, each step an accusation. The flickering light at the end of the hall barely illuminated the warped floorboards. The air felt thick, heavy. My heart pounded against my ribs. The door to the lit room was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with the barrel of my Glock. And then I saw it. A man, late 40s, maybe 50s, sitting in an old wooden chair, back straight, hands folded neatly in his lap. His eyes were wide open, but there was no life in them. His mouth was sewn shut. Thick, black thread held his lips together in a grotesque, jagged pattern. A note was pinned to his chest with a long, rusted nail. I didn't want to read it, but I had to. He spoke when he shouldn't have, so I made sure he never would again. "Do you hear them, officer?" I didn't know what that meant. Not yet, but I was about to find out. Rodriguez walked in just as I finished reading the note. The second he saw the man in the chair, his hand went straight to his gun. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, stepping back. "Who the hell does something like this?" I swallowed hard. I don't know, but someone wanted us to find him. The air in the room felt wrong. Too still, too heavy. My fingers tingled as I grabbed my radio. "This is Officer Harris. We've got a possible homicide at 1438 Elmwood Avenue. Victim is deceased. Suspect unknown." Silence. I tried again. "Dispatch, do you copy?" The radio hissed back at me, the kind of static that crawls under your skin. Rodriguez frowned. "We just used the radio outside. Signal was fine." I looked at the note again. The last line. "Do you hear them, officer?" And then I did. A whisper. Faint. Almost like a breath against my ear. Rodriguez must have seen my face. What is it?" I turned slowly, scanning the dimly lit room. No one else was here, just the dead man in the chair. But I could swear, someone was standing behind me. Then something moved. A shadow, in the corner of the room. It slid along the wall, slow and deliberate, as if it knew we were watching. Rodriguez saw it too. He drew his gun. "Who's there?" he barked. No answer. The whispering got louder. Words I couldn't understand. A wet, garbled sound, like someone trying to talk with their mouth full of water. The dead man in the chair twitched. I know I saw it. His fingers curling just slightly. Rodriguez lost it. He fired 2 shots. Bang, bang. Straight into the chair. The body jolted, but the whispering didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. Louder, closer, like something was standing right between us. I grabbed Rodriguez and yanked him toward the door. "We need to go. Now." We ran. Down the hall, down the stairs. The walls groaned around us, the floorboards rattling under our boots. The front door slammed shut before we reached it. Rodriguez grabbed the knob and yanked. Locked. "What the F you say?" The lights in the house flickered, then went out. We were plunged into darkness. And then, just inches from my ear, the whisper came again. "You shouldn't have come here." My blood turned to ice. That voice, too close, too real. Rodriguez banged against the door, cursing under his breath. It was open when we came in. What the fuck is going on? Harris? I didn't answer. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped my gun. The air in the house had changed, thicker, heavier, suffocating. Like the walls were closing in. And the whispering, it was everywhere now, surrounding us. Rodriguez backed up, his breath ragged. We need to break a window. Get the hell out of here. I nodded. Kitchen. Back of the house. We moved fast, guns drawn. The hardwood creaked beneath our weight. Every step felt like we were being watched. No followed. The kitchen was a mess. Dishes still in the sink, dust coating the counters. And the back window, our way out, was just a few feet away. Rodriguez stepped forward, and the kitchen lights exploded. Glass rained down, popping like gunfire. I ducked, shielding my face. Rodriguez wasn't so lucky. He stumbled back, a deep gash on his arm. And then that sound. A wet, dragging noise, like something crawling across the floor. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, and I saw it. In the corner, half hidden by the counter. A figure, not standing, hunched, twisted. Its arms were too long, its skin like stretched leather. Its head twitched in unnatural jerks, lips sewn shut just like the man in the chair upstairs. But its eyes were open, white, black, locked onto me. I couldn't breathe. The whispering rose to a fever pitch, filling my head, seeping into my bones. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Rodriguez screamed. The thing lunged. I raised my gun, bang, bang. 2 shots straight to the chest. It didn't stop. It didn't even flinch. Rodriguez grabbed my arm. Harris, move. I fired again, bang. As we sprinted for the window, Rodriguez grabbed a chair and smashed the glass. We dove through. The cold night air hit me like a sledgehammer. I rolled onto the overgrown grass, sucking in deep lungfuls of air. Rodriguez was panting beside me, clutching his bleeding arm. Jesus Christ, what the fuck was that? I looked back at the house. The kitchen window was intact, like nothing had happened. But in the darkness beyond the glass, I saw them. The eyes, watching us, unblinking. And then, ever so slowly, the thing raised a single, elongated finger to its sewn-shut lips. H. We didn't stop running until we reached the cruiser. Rodriguez jumped in, slammed the doors and locked them. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely grip the steering wheel. What the fuck was that, Harris? His voice cracked. Did we just fucking see that? I stared at the house, my heart hammering in my chest. It just sat there, still, quiet, like it hadn't just locked us inside with something unnatural. Like there wasn't a corpse upstairs with its mouth sewn shut. Like we hadn't seen that thing. I swallowed hard. We need backup. Now. Rodriguez grabbed the radio. Dispatch, this is Officer Rodriguez. We need immediate assistance at 1438 Elmwood. Static. Then a whisper. You shouldn't have come here. Rodriguez dropped the radio like it had burned him. Fuck this. We're leaving. I didn't argue. The engine roared to life, and we peeled away from that godforsaken house, tires screeching against pavement. My hands were clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms. We didn't speak the whole drive back to the precinct. 1 hour later, the precinct chief Dawson was already waiting when we walked in. Bald, broad, built like a bulldog. He took one look at us and scowled. You look like hell. What the hell happened? Rodriguez spoke first. We don't know. We got a call from that Elmwood house. Found a dead guy. And then, he stopped, shaking his head like he couldn't even believe his own words. Dawson crossed his arms. And then what? I took a deep breath. And then something locked us inside. Dawson's scowl deepened. Rodriguez sat down hard on the nearest desk. Sir, listen to me. There was something in that house. It wasn't human. That's when Dawson's expression changed. Not disbelief, not anger, something else. Like he'd heard this before. I saw his jaw clench, his hands tighten at his sides. There's something you need to see, Dawson said, his voice low. Follow me. He led us down a back hallway, past the break room, past the evidence lockers. He stopped at a metal door and pulled out a key. "This is off the books," he muttered, unlocking it. "Nobody talks about this room." The door creaked open. It was cold inside, freezing. A long metal shelf lined the back wall, stacked with old VHS tapes, some marked with case numbers, some with nothing but dates. Dawson walked to the shelf, pulled one out, and slid it into an old TV sitting in the corner. The screen flickered. Grainy black and white footage filled the screen. A familiar house, 1438 Elmwood Avenue. I felt my stomach drop. The camera feed was from inside the house. The front hallway. Then the footage skipped. The timestamp jumped ahead a few hours. And there it was. The thing. The same twisted, hunched figure we saw in the kitchen. Moving on all fours, watching. A new timestamp. 3 years ago. Another jump. 5 years ago. Another. A decade. The same thing. Same movements. Same stitched mouth. Rodriguez's breathing turned shallow. This thing's been in that house for years. Dawson turned to face us. His eyes were dark, tired. "This isn't the first time officers have been called to that house." A pause. "But it's the first time any have made it out." I stared at Dawson, my pulse pounding in my ears. "What do you mean the first time any have made it out?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to a filing cabinet against the far wall. It was old, rusted, like it hadn't been touched in years. He pulled open the bottom drawer, flipping through thick manila folders until he found the one he wanted. He slapped it onto the table and flipped it open. Rodriguez and I leaned in. The first page was a missing persons report. Officer Daniel Lutz, last seen responding to 1438 Elmwood Avenue, 1997. I flipped to the next page. Officer Steve Holloway, same address, 2005. Officer Janet Fields, 2011. Officer Kyle Becker, 2016. The list went on. 12 officers, all missing, all last seen responding to that house. Rodriguez's hands clenched into fists. "Why the fuck is this not in our system?" Dawson exhaled through his nose. "Because they never left that house. There were no bodies, no evidence, just missing officers. And when we sent more, they vanished too." I flipped back through the files, my stomach twisting into knots. "So why did we make it out?" Dawson looked at me. His expression was unreadable. "I don't know." The room fell into a heavy silence. The only sound was the low hum of the old TV, still frozen on the grainy image of that thing crawling through the halls. I swallowed. "Chief, what the hell is it?" Dawson hesitated, like he wasn't sure whether to tell us. Then he reached for another tape, one that wasn't labeled. Just a black VHS with deep scratches along the edges. "This is the last known footage from Officer Janet Fields' body cam." He pushed it into the player. The screen flickered to life. The final moments of Officer Janet Fields. The footage was shaky. Officer Fields was inside 1438 Elmwood Avenue, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Her breathing was heavy. The timestamp read 2:37 a.m. She was in the upstairs hallway. The same hallway I had walked down just hours ago. She reached the last door. The room where we found the man in the chair. Only in this footage he was still alive. She stepped closer. "Sir? Are you hurt?" The man didn't move, didn't blink. His lips were still sewn shut, but he was shaking, his whole body trembling in the chair. Then, in the corner of the room, movement. The camera swung toward the shadows. A hand slid into frame, then an arm, then it stepped out. The same thing Rodriguez and I had seen. Long-limbed, hunched, leathered skin stretched too tight. But this time, it opened its mouth. The stitches split. Dark. What seems tore apart. And from its throat came the most horrific sound I had ever heard. A scream. No, not a scream. A dozen screams. Voices. Layered over each other. Some high. Some deep. Some pleading. Some laughing. The voices of the missing officers. Fields screamed. The camera spun. The chair was empty. The man was gone. Then the footage glitched, and the last thing we saw was Officer Janet Fields being dragged into the darkness. Back in the present, Rodriguez turned off the TV. His face was pale, his breathing shaky. I felt sick. That house, that thing. It had taken officers before. It had taken their voices. But we had made it out. Why? Rodriguez finally broke the silence. I think we need to go back. I turned to him, stunned. What? His jaw was tight, but there was fear in his eyes. We're the first ones who ever left that house. That means it let us go. But what if? He hesitated. What if it wants us to come back? Dawson stood. If you go back, you might not walk out a second time. Rodriguez and I locked eyes. We both knew it, but I also knew this wasn't over. I could still hear it, the whispering, calling us back. 1438 Elmwood Avenue was waiting. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Rodriguez. We sat in the break room, staring at the flickering fluorescent lights, the hum of the vending machines the only sound between us. My mind replayed the footage over and over. The thing's mouth ripping open, the voices spilling out, Janet Fields being dragged into the dark. And the worst part? The whispering hadn't stopped. Even now, in the safety of the station, I could still hear it. Faint, just beneath the hum of the lights. Calling, beckoning. It wanted us to come back. And deep down, I knew we had no choice. We had to go back. 1:45 a.m. EN, Route 2, 1438 ELMWOOD. Rodriguez drove. His grip on the wheel was white-knuckled, jaw tight. Neither of us had spoken since we left the precinct. What was there to say? We were voluntarily heading back to the place where a dozen officers had vanished without a trace. And we were probably next. As we turned onto Elmwood Avenue, the air changed. Thicker, heavier, like the whole street was holding its breath. The house sat at the end of the road, just as we left it. 2 stories of rotting wood, sagging porch, and a darkness that felt alive. The second we pulled up, the car radio hissed with static. Then a voice. Help me. Rodriguez and I locked eyes. That voice. It was Janet Fields. I grabbed the radio. Fields? Officer Fields? Is that you? Silence. Then again. Help me, Harris. I felt my stomach drop. It knew my name. Rodriguez swallowed hard. Fuck this. Let's do it before I lose my nerve. We stepped out of the car, guns drawn. The porch groaned under our weight as we approached the front door. It was still unlocked. Just like last time, we stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind us. 2 a.m. Inside the house, the whispering was louder now, surrounding us, echoing through the walls, the floor, the very air. We moved carefully, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Rodriguez whispered, "We heading upstairs?" I nodded. "We start in that room." We climbed the staircase, every step creaking like the house was laughing at us. The upstairs hallway was just as we left it. Dim, claustrophobic. The door to the room where we found the man in the chair stood slightly ajar. Only now there was light coming from inside. A soft, pulsing glow. Unnatural. Rodriguez and I exchanged a look. Then, slowly, I pushed the door open. The room had changed, the chair was gone. The walls were covered in symbols, carved deep into the wood, swirling patterns that seemed to move when you looked at them too long. And in the center of the room, a mirror. It was massive, stretching nearly floor to ceiling. The glass was black, like an endless void. Rodriguez stepped forward. "What the hell is this?" Then, a hand pressed against the other side of the glass. I nearly fired my gun. The hand was human, pale, trembling, and then a face appeared. Janet Fields. Her eyes were wide, frantic. Her lips moved, but there was no sound. Rodriguez cursed under his breath. "She's in there." I stepped closer. "Fields." Her mouth formed one word. "Run." The whispering stopped. A deep silence fell over the room, and then something moved behind Janet. A shadow. It was in there with her. She turned, her face twisting in horror. Then the mirror shattered. A force slammed into us, knocking me clear across the room. Rodriguez hit the wall with a sickening crack. The whispering came back all at once. Screaming, shrieking, voices overlapping in a frenzy. And in the broken glass of the mirror, I saw them. The missing officers. Trapped, their mouths sewn shut, eyes filled with terror. Then slowly, they all turned to look at me, and I realized something else was in the room with us. Something that wasn't in the mirror. Rodriguez gasped. "Harris, behind you." I turned, and it was there, standing inches away. Its mouth began to open. The stitches split, and the voices poured out. Couldn't move. The thing stood inches from me, its stitched mouth splitting apart, unraveling thread by thread. A wound opening where lips should be, and the voices they poured out. Not one, dozens. A horrifying, discordant chorus of screams, sobs, laughter, and pleading. "Help me. Run. You're next. Don't let it take you." Rodriguez groaned from the floor, barely conscious, his breath ragged. He was bleeding from his head. I forced myself to move, to lift my gun. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely aim. I fired. Bang. The bullet ripped through its head. And it didn't do a damn thing. The whispering didn't stop. The thing grinned, a mouth torn open too wide, as if the skin on its face was being stretched from the inside. And then it lunged. I barely managed to dive out of the way. The air warped where it moved, like heat rising off asphalt. The second it touched the wall, the wallpaper curled and blackened as if it had been burned. I grabbed Rodriguez by the vest. "We need to go. Now." He groaned but nodded, dragging himself to his feet. We ran. The house wouldn't let us leave. We barreled down the stairs. But the house, it was changing. The walls stretched, pulsing like veins beneath flesh. The floor beneath us seemed to breathe. And then the doors vanished. The front door, gone. The windows, nothing but solid walls. The house was sealing us inside. Rodriguez spun. "Harris, the mirror." I turned just in time to see it. The shards of the shattered mirror were pulling themselves back together, reforming. And in the reflection, the thing was behind us. But in the mirror, it wasn't just one. There were dozens, all standing in the corners of the room, watching, waiting. And then the arms shot out, black, twisted, too many arms, reaching from the mirror, grabbing at us. Rodriguez screamed as a cold, dead hand latched onto his throat. I grabbed him, pulled as hard as I could. The hands were trying to drag him inside, through the mirror, into the void. Janet Fields saved us, and then, through the chaos, I saw her. Janet Fields. She was still in the mirror. She looked at me with wild, terrified eyes. Her lips moved. Couldn't hear her, but I knew what she was saying. "Break it." I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed Rodriguez's baton from his belt, and I swung. The mirror shattered again. Rodriguez collapsed, gasping for air. And the thing screamed. The voices turned to shrieks of pain as the shards exploded outward, cutting through the air like shrapnel. The shadows in the room convulsed, writhing violently. And then they vanished. The walls stopped breathing. The whispering ceased. And the house was silent. The aftermath, we didn't stop running until we were outside. The front door was back. The windows were intact. And the house looked empty, like nothing had ever been inside. Rodriguez dropped to his knees, hands shaking. "Harris, tell me we're done." I wanted to say yes. I really did. But as I stared up at 1438 Elmwood Avenue, I felt something deep in my gut. A knowing. We hadn't ended this. We had just pissed it off. The precinct felt wrong. Rodriguez and I sat in the break room, both of us silent, both of us still shaking. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The stitched mouth splitting apart, the voices pouring out. I kept waiting for something else to happen, for the whispering to start again. But it didn't, and somehow that was worse. Rodriguez finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "You gonna tell Dawson?" I exhaled. "Yeah, he needs to know." We made our way to his office, still covered in dirt, blood, and sweat. Dawson was at his desk, nursing a coffee, looking like he hadn't slept in years. When he saw us, he didn't ask a single question, just gestured for us to sit. I told him everything. The mirror, the whispering, the thing trying to pull us in, how Janet Fields saved us. When I finished, he sat back in his chair, rubbing his face. "Dawson," I said, leaning forward. "What the hell is in that house?" He stared at me for a long time. Then he pulled something out of his desk. An old, yellowed case file. He slid it across the desk. I hesitated before flipping it open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The first officer who disappeared, Officer Daniel Lutz, 1997. Not missing. Declared dead. I scanned the report, my hands going numb. The cause of death? Self-inflicted. Found inside 1438 Elmwood Avenue. His lips had been sewn shut. I turned the page, my stomach twisting. A handwritten note was stapled to the back. It was Daniel Lutz's last recorded statement. A confession. I swallowed hard and started reading. The last words of Daniel Lutz: "It watches. It waits. Takes your voice. Takes your mind. The longer you stay, the harder it is to leave. I can hear them now. The ones it took before me. Their voices are inside me. Inside my head. Whispering. Telling me things I don't want to know. I tried to leave. It let me. Just like it let the others. But it's not finished with me. It never lets you go. Not really. Takes something from you. Leaves something behind. I hear them when I close my eyes. I hear them when I sleep. And soon I won't be able to stop myself. I know what happens next. I have to make sure it can't use me. I have to make sure I never speak again. I'm so sorry." There was a final note at the bottom, written in someone else's handwriting. Officer Lutz was found in the upstairs bedroom of 1438 Elmwood Avenue. His mouth had been sewn shut with his own hands. The needle was still in his fingers. I dropped the file. My hands were trembling. Rodriguez whispered, "Jesus Christ." Dawson took a long sip of coffee. "That's why we don't send people in there anymore." I shook my head. "Then why the hell did we get the call? Why send us?" Dawson hesitated. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "You were never sent." Rodriguez stiffened. "What?" Dawson met my eyes. "The dispatcher never called you. There was no official report. That call, whatever called you, it wasn't from us." My mouth went dry. Rodriguez's voice was barely above a whisper. "Then who the fuck sent us there?" Dawson leaned forward, eyes dark. "You already know the answer to that." The room felt colder. I suddenly became very aware of the silence. The whispering had stopped, but somehow, I knew it wasn't gone. It was waiting, because Lutz was right. It never lets you go. I didn't sleep. Neither did Rodriguez. We stayed in the precinct, sitting in silence, replaying every second of what had happened inside that house. Every whisper, every movement, the thing in the mirror, the hands. But the worst part, I could still feel it. Not hear it, not see it, but feel it, like something had crawled inside me and made a home. Rodriguez must have felt it too. He sat hunched over, head in his hands, his breathing shallow. He looked wrong, pale, like a man who was coming down with something awful. "Rodriguez," I muttered. "You good?" He didn't look at me, didn't answer. Dawson came back an hour later, a thick file under his arm. He dropped it on the table. I had archives pull this for me. The first reports on 1438 Elmwood. I stared at it. "How far back does it go?" Dawson exhaled. "Over 100 years. A heavy silence settled over the room. Rodriguez finally looked up. "What was the first case?" Dawson opened the file. His eyes scanned the pages, and then he pulled out a single black and white photograph. He slid it across the table. I wish I'd never looked. It was an old crime scene photo. Family, mother, father, 2 kids. Their bodies sitting in chairs in the upstairs bedroom. All of them with their lips sewn shut. Dawson tapped the back of the photo. 1923. A doctor named Richard Bellows owned the house. The reports say he lost his mind. Believed his family was hearing voices. I swallowed. So he did that to them? Dawson's jaw tightened. No, Rodriguez's eyes darkened. What do you mean, no? Dawson exhaled, rubbing his temple. They did it to themselves. A beat of silence. Then he flipped the page. And there it was. A note, just like Lutz's. The last words of Richard Bellow's wife: we shouldn't have listened. We should have left. Told us things we weren't supposed to know. Showed us things we weren't meant to see. Took our voices first. Then it took our minds. The only way to be free is silence. It must not spread. It must not be heard. We must never speak again. I'm so sorry. I felt cold all over. Dawson closed the file. You see the pattern now? I did. Rodriguez's voice was hoarse. Every time someone goes in that house. Dawson nodded. It follows them out. I clenched my fists. So what do we do? Dawson's expression darkened. There's only ever been one way to stop it. The last rule of 1438 ELMWOD. He pulled out one last old, yellowed piece of paper. It was handwritten. Instructions. If you hear the whispering, do not answer. Do not repeat what it tells you. If you bring it out, you must return to the house. And when you go back, you must never leave again. The air in the room felt heavier. Rodriguez and I looked at each other. I knew what he was thinking. We had heard it. We had brought it out. And now, we had to go back. One last time. The next night, we went back. Rodriguez and I didn't talk about it. There was nothing left to say. We knew the rules. We had broken them. And now we had to fix it. Dawson didn't try to stop us. I think he knew there was no stopping this. So he just gave us one last look before we walked out of the precinct and said, "Don't come back." I don't think he meant it as an order. I think he meant it as a warning. 1:57 a.m., 1438. Elmwood Avenue. The house was waiting. Same rotting wood. Same sagging porch. Same flickering light in the upstairs window. But this time we could feel it breathing. Rodriguez exhaled, gripping his gun even though we both knew it wouldn't help. You ready? I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. We stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind us. The house was alive. The walls moved. Not like before, not just pulsing, they rippled, stretched, contracting like lungs. And the whispering, it was inside my head now. Hissing, murmuring, pleading. Stay. It's quieter here. No more pain. Rodriguez flinched, gripping his head. He was hearing it too. But I forced myself forward. Toward the staircase. Toward the room where it all started. And that's when I heard her. Janet Fields. Harris. I froze. She was standing at the top of the stairs. Only, it wasn't her anymore. Her eyes were black. Her lips were stitched shut. Rodriguez's breath hitched. Jesus. Janet tilted her head, her arms hanging limp at her sides. And then, she opened her mouth. The stitches ripped apart, and all of the voices poured out at once. Lutz, Holloway, Becker, all the missing officers. Screaming. It wanted us. Rodriguez grabbed my arm. The mirror. He was right. That's where it was coming from. The gateway. We ran. The final moment, the upstairs room was the same as before. Same walls covered in symbols. Same mirror. Only this time it wasn't broken. The glass was whole, but it was black. A void. A doorway. Rodriguez and I exchanged one last look. Then he dropped his gun. I followed. No point in carrying them anymore. I stepped forward, my reflection warping in the black glass. And I heard it. One final whisper. You are home now. I stepped into the mirror. Rodriguez followed, and the world vanished. The aftermath. 2 days later, Dawson filed the paperwork. Officers Harris and Rodriguez, missing in action. No bodies were ever found. No reports were ever made. The case was closed. But at night, when Dawson sat alone in his office, he swore he could hear it. A whisper. So soft, so quiet, calling him back to 1438 Elmwood Avenue. Because the house is never empty, and it's always waiting.